The inside story on the issues that affect you and your community. This is Local 12 Newsmakers.
I know we can win the battles ahead. I know we will win the battles ahead when we put our values forward, when we lead together.
Last month, the Democratic National Committee chose new leadership in the face of disastrous national defeats in November and local reverses over the last decade. Good morning and welcome to Local 12 Newsmakers. I'm Dan Hurley. The victory of Donald Trump exposed the loss of contact between the Democratic Party and its traditional base of support among manufacturing workers, labor union members, and the middle class. But the problems facing the party go much broader and deeper. Over the last decade, Democrats have lost 1,000 statewide elected officials across the country. Republicans have 31 governors, while the Democrats have only 18. One state has an independent. Republicans now control majorities in 67 of the 98 state legislative houses. And in 23 states, Republicans hold the governor's seat and majorities in the houses of legislature. The Democrats control the executive position and legislative houses in only 7 states. To talk about what the Democratic Party plans to do about this, I am joined now by David Pepper, the chair of the Democratic Party. At the same meeting that I just blanked, but the new DNC chair was elected. Mr. Pepper was elected vice president of the Association of State Democratic Chairs, representing the Midwest. David, welcome to Newsmakers.
Thanks, good to be here.
Back. I painted a pretty bleak picture there.
Yeah. You did.
Do you want to modify that in any way?
The only thing I'd say is you do over decades see a pattern where the party in the White House typically loses at other levels while they remain in the White House. But that doesn't try and make it any more rosy. The losses are what they were, not good enough, and it's more importantly than just sort of the political math. We believe people are really paying a price. I mean, right now we are seeing attacks on things like health care and other things that are a result of this. So real people suffer when you see the results that we're seeing, and we have to do better.
How do you feel about Tom Perez being elected the new chair of the DNC?
First of all, I think actually we had a lot of good candidates, and it was actually a very healthy debate because people spent...
And it was a debate.
It was a
close.
debate, and people went all over. We had almost every candidate come through Ohio to address our members, and the debate was those numbers you just put up on the screen. It was how has this happened? How can we do better? And I would say Tom Perez himself is a very unique, authentic leader. I think he'll do a great job. But the entire process of picking him led to a lot of very heartfelt discussions to not brush past the numbers and the results you just talked about, but to really confront them and figure out how to do better. So he will be a great leader, I believe. I know him well, and I'm a big fan of his. But the process we used to get to that point, this was not sort of backroom deals and someone anointing anyone. He had to go out and earn it. And other people also brought a lot to the conversation. And then, of course, he picked Keith Ellison as the deputy chair right after, so we're also seeing a lot of unifying. So overall... Keith
Ellison being his primary competition.
Correct.
For that.
And it was a good competition, but the two of them always were very positive towards one another. They both put a lot of ideas forward, and like I said, I think they'll be a great team, and I also think we are a better party because we had a very open, honest debate about how we have to do better.
That's the national level. I want to take a look at Ohio because that's your area, right, and you're responsible for that. Even though a majority of Ohioans voted for Obama twice and the state swung to Trump last November, Ohio has 1 Republican and 1 Democratic senator in Washington. When you get to the state level, the swing state image disappears. The governor and all the statewide elected officials are Republicans. The Ohio Senate is dominated by Republicans 24-9, and the Ohio House is dominated by Republicans 66 to 23. David, That's your responsibility.
Right.
How do you begin to turn that around?
Well, two things. One, the State House is mainly a result of egregious gerrymandering. Those numbers are where they are because the Republicans in 2011 drew the worst map in the history of Ohio that basically guaranteed supermajorities. But on the statewide, again, going back to the history, the truth is in the last 50 years, when Democrats are in the White House, we literally have not once won statewide. The governor races and the others. When Republicans have been in the White House, except for George Herbert Walker Bush's one term, Democrats have always gone on to win statewide. So Ohioans like the balance. Obviously, the history tells us that. Our goal then, obviously, is in 2018, make that history repeat itself. And the way we do that is the same way it's happened in the past. You know, Reagan beat Carter by more than Trump beat Clinton. 2 years later, Dick Celeste won with 22% of the vote. Howard Metzenbaum got reelected with 15% of the vote. Our goal is obviously to make that happen again. And we're already seeing the signs of some of why that happens. One, you're seeing Democrats all over the state much more energized than they were even a year ago because of some of the things that Trump is doing and that Paul Ryan is doing. You also see now, all of a sudden, the Republicans own Ohio's economy. And right now, Ohio is not doing well at all. We are in our 48th out of 49 months where we've trailed the national recovery. Wages are where they were 30 years ago. Our schools are collapsing because they've been defunded in this for-profit charter school scam that's been going on for a long time. And we are literally the #1 state in the nation when it comes to heroin and opioid overdoses. So the bottom line is in 18, we actually are the candidates for change versus years of status quo out of Columbus that aren't working very well.
But that gets down to, it's always who runs against who. Right at the moment, because the Republicans control all the statewide elected officials, auditor, Secretary of State, with Attorney General, they have some candidates that are pretty broadly known, widely known, have a track record. On the Democratic side, who do you see emerging realistically? There's a lot of names out there, but realistically.
Well, the one thing I would disagree with is I think on the Republican governor side, the only name that's really well known is Mike DeWine. As a broader name.
John Husted?
Not, if you did a poll today, John Husted is not very well known. Okay. You know, the names that are known well in Ohio are John Kasich, Mike DeWine, Sherrod Brown. I think we're talking pretty universally known. Almost every other figure in Ohio politics is known by insiders, but you don't really achieve that. So I think for that reason, Mike DeWine's probably the favorite in that primary. But if you listen to what I just talked about before, if people want change in Ohio, I don't think anyone imaginable represents change less than Mike DeWine. We will have a number of candidates who I think will run very good campaigns about how we need to change the direction. We have some good legislators who are looking at it. The mayor of Dayton is looking at it. Nan Whaley. Recently, Betty Sutton, who is a very successful congresswoman from Northern Ohio, who has got a great track record, is looking at it.
No name down here, though.
That's okay. I mean, like I said, the goal is if we have to be the change of a very bad direction. Mm-hmm. Mike DeWine couldn't sort of symbolize more status quo Ohio. Now, if Ohio was doing well, that'd be great. But if Ohio is struggling, which we are, one reason Trump did well in Ohio is because he made the point that economically things aren't going very well outside of a few cities. Actually, it's true. Mm-hmm. If you go to Steubenville or Medina or Sandusky, where I go all the time, the job situation is bleak. Schools are struggling because of decisions by Columbus. And we will have a candidate, whoever wins our primary will have, I think, a lot of attention by winning the primary, and they will have a far better case to make that they will change the direction of the state versus the Republicans.
What do you think the likelihood of Richard Cordray coming back and being available and being interested to run?
So I didn't mention him. He himself can't even talk about politics because, as you know, he runs the CFPB. The Consumer Finance Protection Bureau.
There you go.
He's an amazing public servant. Ohio, he would be probably the best known name of the Democrats. But he's committed to that agency. Now, there's talk every day that Donald Trump's going to fire him. That would be very legally problematic for Trump to do that because it's actually a term that lasts through 2018. Right. If Rich Cordray were fired and a court at some point upheld the firing, I think he could very well come back and run for governor. But in the meantime, Rich is dedicated as he should be to doing that job.
Because he believes that if he gets fired, the whole effort on consumer protection will get undermined.
Not only is he not there to lead it, the whole point of the CFPB was independent.
Right.
It's a term. And so if he were to leave, he literally would pull the rug out from under an agency and the whole purpose of it. He's not going to do that. If he were fired and it was upheld, I actually think he would probably enter the governor's race.
You know, one of the things that, since you've been chair of the statewide party, you have said, and I think you've said it on this show, you need to develop a bench.
Right.
And you also, I want to put that together with the gerrymandering thing.
Right.
Now, I don't want to take a look at a state office. I want to take a look at a map of the 1st Congressional District, which is a national, this is Steve Shabitt's district, but that's a bleak map for a Democrat to think about running. You've got some young Democrats on Cincinnati City Council, just in one place,
right,
who, you know, might think about running on a higher up, but if they're facing that, they may not think they have any place to go. Running there and losing, just to be losing, doesn't make much sense.
Yeah, I'll only say, first of all, that's an embarrassing map when it comes to democracy. It's not just a bleak map for us, and that's a map that looks like a whole lot of districts in Ohio. We are in the middle of the worst gerrymander in Ohio's history. And it has terrible consequences. The worst consequence is the partisanship you see in Washington. The worst is that people like Shabbat and Wenstrup won't even have town hall meetings with their own constituents because they don't feel like they have to, because they're basically reappointed every 2 years. It's not even an election. But it also has the consequence you mentioned, which is it's hard to build a bench when most of the next step offices you'd run for look impossible to run for. So I think we need real reform of this. But I also would tell you, in a wave year, crazy things do happen. And what's interesting is that 1st district is now probably the most winnable district in Ohio that a Republican holds. So interestingly, I'm having a number of candidates. I mentioned all the energy and activity around the state. One of the ways that we're seeing activity is people want to run. They want to take on people who are refusing to really stand up for basic American principles. So I'm actually seeing in the 1st district and many others, a lot of people come forward interested in running despite how bad that map looks.
I want to go back and just have time for one last question, and that is, with all of the state offices controlled by the Republicans, the only way that map's going to change after the next census, so we're now looking out at, 2022, is if some Democrats get in those statewide offices and balance out.
Correct.
That is critical for you, right?
Yeah, and 2018 is probably the most important election for Ohio Democrats in 50 years. Because we know the history, but history doesn't guarantee anything. We know we can do it. It's been done before. I mentioned 1982. But 18 is the year where the apportionment board is decided. Right. And that is the board. Now, there's been some reform thanks to another issue that passed a couple years ago. But, we know what Republicans have done with this board when they've been in it. They've done everything they can to draw maps as crazy as the one you just saw. We need to win so we can finally end this gerrymandering and have, once again, legislatures that actually represent their citizens, because those legislators had to win competitive races. Right now, that's just not how our system works. And it's, President Trump, we haven't talked about much, but obviously very problematic. But equally problematic is the way our system was designed. Was the House of Representatives was actually supposed to be a check on an executive. And it would reflect the people's concern about the executive. But if you have gerrymandering like you have it, you no longer have that structural sort of safeguard in place. So it doubles down on concerns about an out-of-control executive when you have gerrymandering like we have in Ohio.
Well, David, you got a lot of work and interesting structure and great sort of analysis here. It's going to be interesting to see what the Democratic Party does, both nationally and statewide.
We actually have a lot of momentum with all the energy we're seeing, so we feel good about what we're seeing going into 18.
Okay, we'll see what happens.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you for being here. Stay tuned after the break. Locally and nationally, scientists are organizing a March for Science to counter the increasing dismal dismissal of science. David? On Thursday, Scott Pruitt, the Secretary of the EPA, stated that he rejects the overwhelming scientific evidence that carbon dioxide is a primary contributor to global warming. Given his long history of suing the EPA, the agency he now leads, this should not be a surprise. That scientific consensus does not fit comfortably into the political agenda of President Trump, who wants to unleash coal and oil production and halt the increasing adoption of renewable fuel sources. Welcome back. Over the last 150 years, humans have lived in a scientific age. Consciously and unconsciously, our understanding of ourselves and the world around us is grounded in science. Since the 1880s, the only way to win intellectual respect and authority has been to embrace the scientific method. That may seem obvious in fields like chemistry, biology, medicine, and physics, but is equally true in the disciplines like history, sociology, political science, which was once called political philosophy, and every field of business, management, finance, marketing. They've all embraced a scientific, evidence-based approach. But science has always been uncomfortable for politicians. In the 1950s, some politicians charged fluoridation of water was a communist plot. Today, political opposition spans groups on the right and left, impacting the scientific evaluation of everything from climate change to genetically modified foods and the efficiency and effectiveness of safety of vaccinations. At this moment, when many groups feel compelled to take very public stands to clarify their values and commitments, scientists are joining the ranks of the marchers. On April the 22nd, there will be marches for science in Washington, D.C. and around the country, including right here in Cincinnati. I'm joined now by two local scientists who have devoted their careers to helping the public better understand the nature of science and the scientific method. Dean Regas is an astronomer at the Cincinnati Observatory. He presents hundreds of programs every year, is the author of a new book, Facts from Space, and co-hosts the Stargazers, which airs on 100 PBS stations and frequently joins Ira Flato on Science Friday. And Glenn Storrs, the Associate Vice President for Collections and Research, and the Withrow Farney, Curator of Vertebrate Paleontology at the Cincinnati Museum Center. Dr. Storrs is an expert on dinosaurs, very popular, and has led paleontological expeditions in North America, Europe, Asia, and North Africa. Welcome to Newsmakers.
Oh, thanks for having us.
Let's start out. Glenn, you and I, we used to have our offices right next to each other at the Museum Center.
Indeed.
What do you think that science is that you think maybe the way it gets talked about isn't fully understood?
Yeah, this is a big problem in our society today, really. Science isn't just a body of facts, and people often think of their school days when they were forced to memorize things. And if that's all they understand science to be, then perhaps their education is at fault. That's a whole other issue. But science is a methodology. It's a process.
The scientific method.
The scientific method, exactly. So you create a hypothesis, you go out and search for evidence, you observe, you experiment, collect data, test these hypotheses and draw conclusions. So it's an evidence-based process that attempts to explain the natural world around us. It's not opinion, which is what often happens in today's politicized world. People will suggest that their opinion is as good as some scientific experts' ideas.
So, Dean, this question of evidence-based, it's not that scientists don't disagree with each other. They do.
Oh, they disagree with each other all the time. In the field of astronomy, there's great debates that have been happening throughout history.
Probably one of the oldest real sciences.
Well, I would say that, but I guess I'm biased. You know,
no, so I would say it too.
Yeah, that astronomy is one of the earliest sciences, and our models of the universe are constantly changing. I've been at the observatory 17 years, and we've seen theories change. We've seen just new evidence coming from new telescopes, and that's what's exciting about the field, is that it's evolving, it's constantly changing. We get new evidence, we get new data from telescopes, from missions, and then we try to make sense of that and make the best theories out of it.
So the process here is there's a hypothesis which you go out to try to find evidence to prove or disprove. evidence emerges, sometimes evidence, even when you feel like you've settled something, new evidence, then you go back and you adjust the hypothesis, and the process just continues, right?
Absolutely. So you build upon the work of people before you.
This is doing science. It's not just learning it in a textbook someplace.
Exactly. It's not a static issue.
Yeah, and scientists are very thick-skinned about this. They're not like, oh, I'm attached to this theory and I'm going to fight it to the end of the earth. They want it to be tested. They want it to be verified or disproven. They would rather have something be disproven than to believe in something that's not true.
Well, you bring that up, but one of the issues right now is in the EPA, and that's sort of where I kicked it off because of what the statement that was made a couple days ago. There are people who have made it clear, people who are on the inside, that right now they can't publish papers, they can't post anything, they can't continue the conversation among their scientific community because there's sort of a shutdown of that scientific process that's going on. It's not just we're opposed to that theory, it's the process that's being interrupted.
Exactly, and that's anathema to scientists. If you can't get your results out there in peer-reviewed venues for others to evaluate and to repeat, then you're really you're not contributing to advancement of knowledge.
And that has to be in our society today, that has to be on an international level, right? It's not something just American scientists. Your community is a global community.
Definitely. Yeah, this isn't just an American thing. This isn't a nationalist thing. Scientists work together across borders. In the field of astronomy, we share telescope time with people around the world. We collaborate internationally with groups. Yeah, there's nothing. If there's anything, it's just this drive for knowledge, and it's universal.
So, what's your reaction? Not only what's happening over the last few months with the Trump administration, but there's sort of been an attack on science going on for some time here. What's your reaction to that, and do you interact with elected politicians at all that maybe have a chance to chime in and help them?
Yeah, it's a difficult issue, and scientists traditionally have tried to stay out of political fora because science is a nonpartisan, or ideally should be a nonpartisan practice pursuing this process. But when you see people politicize it, initially, of course, you're annoyed at that. But on a larger scale, we're attacking the fabric of our society. Cincinnati is a city that has its founding and its progress based on scientific and engineering principles like P&G, the universities, GE, on and on and on. We are damaging American society if we don't move science and engineering forward, and if we end up with a populace that is poorly educated in the process of science.
And the irony here is that on an education level, and you raised the whole question of the relationship of education, is the thrust over the last decade at least has been the emphasis on STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And some of this really runs counter to that.
Yeah, and like what Glenn said, I interact more with the public than with politicians, and I have noticed in the last 10 years there is this not quite distrust of scientists, but people call us up all the time at the observatory and say, they want some information of things that they heard. And they approach it with a very non-scientific thing. They say, I heard on the news they discovered this. And then we tell them, well, okay, it's not exactly like that. And then they listen and they say, well, okay, you're wrong. I'm going to go to another opinion. And so they think that they come to us as experts in the field. But when we don't give the correct answer that they're looking for, then they will go somewhere else. And I find that kind of disturbing.
There's going to be these marches for science around the country. Who do you hope joins those marches? Are you going to join those marches? What kind of people do you want in those marches?
Well, I certainly will be part of those marches, not as a representative necessarily of Museum Center, but as a representative of my discipline and someone who practices science, someone who believes in science, and someone who believes in science education. So certainly those types of people, scientists, should be out there representing their beliefs, their fields of endeavor, science educators, and just people in general who think that this society deserves better than attacks on science and attacks on education. We really need to stand up for evidence-based approach to making decisions.
We only have about 30 seconds, but what's your view on this?
I'm hoping that teachers and students come to these marches, especially the one in Cincinnati, because we want to really highlight science education around the community. We have some great organizations, and we found that the power of the field trip is great. We want people students to come out to do some field trips.
Okay, I want to make sure people know how to find out about all of this. If you want more information about the March for Science and would like to get involved, it will take place on April the 22nd and start on Fountain Square at 10 o'clock in the morning. The march will make its way to City Hall. If you can find out more at the website, marchforsciencecincinnati.com, on Facebook at March for Science Cincinnati, and on Twitter, Science March, CIN. So all these sort of variations, it's out there every place. Thank you for being here this morning, and thank you for joining us this morning and making Newsmakers a part of your Sunday morning. Join us again next week to meet the men and the women shaping our community for a better future. Have a good week.